Putin's Crimea is over. It was nice while it lasted, wasn't it, Vladimir? After illegally annexing the Crimean Peninsula and tearing it away from Ukraine, that stolen territory looked like the crown jewel bolted onto Russia's spurious claim to an entire country. Then came a war that was supposed to last days and instead ground on for years. Now that crown jewel is being cut off piece by piece, road by road, ship by ship. Ukraine isn't storming Crimea with tanks. It's doing something colder and, in the long run, far more devastating. It's isolating the peninsula, starving it, and turning it from Russia's greatest asset into one of its heaviest liabilities. For years, Crimea was untouchable, a fortress bristling with air defense, a launch pad Putin treated as proof that his war was unstoppable. That fortress is now cracking from the inside, and the people paying the price for it are the very officials Russia installed to run it. Middle-range strikes are the key to all of it, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how and why Ukraine is dismantling Russia's grip on Crimea, piece by piece. Before we get into the details, if you want more deep dives like this one, make sure you're subscribed to Military Show and have notifications turned on. This campaign is moving fast, and there is a lot more to come. Let's start with the why. On May 27th, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense officially launched a program called Logistics Lockdown. Around $113 million is being funneled into it, with the first phase of funding going directly to the units carrying out middle-range strikes against Russian logistics across occupied Ukraine. In the offices of the puppet government Putin installed in Crimea, that announcement would have set off alarm bells, not because it was new information, but because it confirmed what officials there already knew. Crimea and the territories surrounding it had already been living through months of expanding strikes against everything from fuel depots to military targets. Logistics lockdown wasn't a new threat. It was the official, funded continuation of a campaign that was already tearing Crimea apart. The idea is simple. Wherever Russia sends its trucks and its tankers, Ukraine hits them, and those strikes are set to continue through the summer and beyond. This is about seizing the initiative. Ukrainian drones are crashing down across Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, and frontline troops in every one of those regions are feeling the pain of lost supplies and thinning reserves. But nowhere feels it more than Crimea, because Crimea depends entirely on logistical arteries running through occupied Ukraine to stay supplied and remain a viable launchpad for Russia's war. Isolating Crimea is Ukraine's ultimate goal, and to pull it off, Ukraine has had to get smart about where it strikes. Sending drones into the densest concentrations of Russian air defense, dug in along the front lines, is a great way to lose most of those drones before they hit anything. Ukraine doesn't want that. It needs a high success rate to make logistics lockdown actually work. So over the past few months, we've watched Ukrainian drones actively avoid the thickest air defense belts and instead punch deep behind them, hunting for military convoys and fuel trucks moving to and from Crimea. That makes nearly all of occupied Ukraine fair game, since Crimea functions as the logistical node through which Russia channels troops and supplies from the mainland into the war. The scale of this campaign has been building for months, and the numbers back it up. Ukraine's mid-range strikes quadrupled between February and April, doubled again between March and April, and then climbed roughly 50% higher still in May compared to April, and the trend hasn't slowed since. The independent Russian outlet Meduza has tracked around 270 separate strikes on Russian trucks and logistics hubs so far this year, and found something remarkable when it mapped them. The median distance of each strike behind the front line, once just a few kilometers, has stretched out to tens of kilometers. A French open-source analyst tallied roughly 500 individual attacks between May 1st and June 18th alone, working purely from geolocated footage posted online, and even that is likely an undercount, since not every strike gets filmed or geolocated. Cutting Crimea off from the rest of occupied Ukraine is a massive undertaking, and Russia has leaned on the peninsula's usefulness since the very first days of the invasion. Crimea has been a launch pad for Russia's offensive operations from the start, home to military airfields, ammunition depots, missile and drone launch sites, and entire arsenals feeding troops and equipment into occupied Ukraine. From Crimea, Russia has deployed submarines and warships into the Black Sea, at least it used to. In the months before February 2022, Russia quietly amassed troops and weapons on the peninsula, and it was those forces that seized large parts of southern Ukraine within days of the invasion, setting the stage for the grinding war that followed. Even before that, Crimea was a symbol of Russian strength. Ukrainer reported that back in 2019, Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs had already documented 12 multiple launch rocket systems, 40 tanks, 62 helicopters, 122 combat aircraft, 162 heavy artillery units, and 583 armored vehicles stationed on the peninsula. That buildup happened over years, and it made Crimea central to everything Russia is doing now. Isolating it isn't a nice to have for Ukraine. It's about pulling the linchpin out of Russia's entire war strategy. And the campaign isn't confined to Crimea's own borders. The same middle strike logic has been applied to the M14 highway and its extension, sometimes referred to as the R150, running from Russia into occupied Luhansk, Donetsk, and Mariupol. Existing logistical problems in those oblasts, some dating back years, are being made worse by the same drones hunting fuel trucks near Crimea. Donetsk has struggled with water shortages ever since a pipeline carrying drinking water from the river Donets was destroyed early in the war, and residents there say the problem has only deepened as water supply trucks moving along the highway increasingly become targets themselves. It's a grim illustration of how a strategy built around choking supply lines doesn't stay neatly contained to one region. It bleeds outward, and ordinary people on the ground absorb the consequences long before generals do. So that's the why. Now let's get into the how. The emergence of a new generation of medium-range strike drones has changed everything about how Ukraine approaches Crimea. These drones can hit targets at what's called operational depth, roughly 20 to 200 kilometers behind the front lines. That's where Russian logistics live: command posts, troop staging areas, scattered air defense batteries, fuel depots, and supply stations. It's from this zone that everything happening on the front gets organized and supplied, which is exactly why striking it disrupts frontline operations and isolates Crimea at the same time. Take the R280 highway, sometimes called the Novorossiya Highway, which links Rostov-on-Don in Russia to the southern Ukrainian regions of Mariupol and Melitopol and onward into Crimea. That road has become a graveyard for Russian vehicles. It became Russia's main route into the peninsula once repeated Ukrainian strikes on the Kerch Bridge exposed that crossing as dangerously unreliable. The Guardian reported that Ukraine's 412th Nemesis Brigade led the charge in turning that stretch of highway into what soldiers now call the Highway of Death, destroying dozens of trucks and tankers along it since May. Satellite imagery reviewed by the Kyiv Post shows more than 300 burned out or demolished Russian truck hulls scattered along the R280 in the first half of June alone, on top of everything hit back in May, and the pressure kept building. Commander Robert Madyar Brovdy, who leads Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, reported in early June that Russian military cargo traffic along that corridor had fallen by more than 70% over just 2 weeks. Cutting off one road was never going to be enough, and Russia found that out the hard way. With the R280 turned into a shooting gallery, Ukraine went hunting elsewhere. Logistical nodes in Kherson, which also link occupied Ukraine to Crimea, became the next target. In early June, the Chonhar Bridge came under repeated attack, forcing Russia to divert traffic onto makeshift pontoon crossings that simply can't handle the volume needed to keep Crimea supplied. The Kyiv Post reported that Ukraine also hit the Henichesk Bridge and the Armyansk Bridge, the very crossing Russia had tried to divert traffic to after Chonhar became unusable and struck a railway line in Kherson on the same day, showing Russia it couldn't rely on rail transport either. According to a June 21st assessment from the Institute for the Study of War, Ukrainian forces also struck railway bridges over the North Crimean Canal near Rozdolny and near Chongar, crossings Russia had been using to move personnel and ammunition. Analysts told the Kyiv Independent that Ukraine appears to have more than enough capacity to keep these bridges and logistics pathways disabled indefinitely, even as Russia scrambles to build alternative crossings nearby. None of this is being done with one type of weapon. Ukraine's medium-range arsenal has grown into a small ecosystem of purpose-built drones. The newer Behemoth model reportedly cruises at around 110 miles per hour and can carry a warhead of roughly 154 pounds, giving it enough range and payload to reach convoys well behind the front rather than just skimming the edge of it. Older proven designs like the Liuti and the FP-1 are still flying alongside it, each suited to slightly different targets and ranges. And then there's the drone nobody officially talks about much, a reportedly top-secret platform known as the Morrigan, said to specialize in taking down Russian air defense systems and support infrastructure ahead of the strike packages that follow, effectively clearing a path for everything else. Whatever the exact mix on any given night, the combined effect is the same. Russian convoys that once moved with relative confidence now move blind, exposed, and increasingly rarely. What we're watching is a methodical strategy. First, sever the main artery and make the R2801 of the riskiest roads in occupied Ukraine. That road is still a target, and it will remain one for as long as Russia depends on it. Then, one by one, cut every other vein feeding the peninsula. That leaves Crimea isolated and increasingly alone. Before we go further, a quick reminder. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, hitting subscribe on Military Show genuinely helps the channel keep making it. Now back to Crimea. Ukraine's naval campaign has been just as relentless. Its fleet of maritime drones has already turned the Black Sea into a graveyard for Russian ships, despite Ukraine barely having a navy of its own. United 24 media reports that Ukraine's sea drones now function as full platforms rather than single-use weapons, some loaded with hundreds of kilograms of explosives for direct kamikaze strikes, others serving as seaborne launch pads for aerial drones that can hit both ships and airborne targets. That pressure has produced results. Reporting from Atesh, the partisan resistance network operating inside occupied Crimea, indicates that Russia's Black Sea Fleet has been quietly relocating its remaining command structures from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk on the Russian mainland, with officers reportedly moving their families out ahead of any formal order. It's a remarkable admission of just how untenable Sevastopol has become as a home port. The symbolism runs deep, too. Sevastopol has served as home to the fleet for more than 2 centuries, and its old headquarters building, overlooking the harbor since the early 1900s, was already struck by a Ukrainian missile back in 2023. Watching the command structure now quietly slip away to Novorossiysk, without so much as an official announcement, tells you everything about how far Russia's naval position in Crimea has fallen since this war began. Ukraine has also expanded its naval focus into the Sea of Azov, which borders Crimea's eastern coast. On June 5th, the BBC reported that Ukraine had confirmed strikes on 5 ships in the Azov Sea and the coastal waters around the occupied territories. Vessels, Ukraine says, were involved in stealing Ukrainian grain and ferrying fuel and military cargo. Then on June 21st came one of the most significant nights of the entire campaign. The Institute for the Study of War documented a coordinated strike on Russian maritime logistics, oil infrastructure, and air defense across the Kerch Strait and neighboring Krasnodar Krai. Ukrainian drones hit Port Kavkaz on the Chushka Spit and the TES Terminal 1 oil depot in Kerch, both critical to ferrying fuel across the strait, and in the process disabled 4 S-400 radar stations and 2 Pantsir air defense systems positioned to protect the Kerch Bridge itself. Reuters quoted Brovdi explaining the underlying logic. Ukraine is systematically dismantling Russian air defense, reducing the Black Sea Fleet's footprint, and severing logistics and energy infrastructure, all to strip Crimea of its use as a springboard for future offensives. As one Ukrainian security analyst, Oksana Kuzan, put it to the Kyiv Independent, Ukraine is deliberately exhausting Crimea, and that exhaustion feeds directly into the discontent already simmering among the people forced to live under occupation there. The maritime blockade doesn't stop at ships and depots. It extends into the fuel and food that are supposed to keep Crimea running, and that brings us to what life on the peninsula actually looks like right now. By early June, occupation authorities had already imposed fuel rationing, limiting sales to between 20 and 30 liters per person, with civilian vehicles placed behind military transport, police, and ambulances in the queue. That rationing didn't hold. On June 12th, The Independent reported that gas stations across Crimea were running dry entirely, producing the worst fuel crisis the peninsula has experienced since the 2014 occupation began. Then, On the night of June 21st, Ukraine carried out one of its largest strikes on the peninsula to date, hitting military and energy facilities. Russian-installed Crimea Governor Sergei Aksyonov confirmed there were casualties in the attack and announced that starting that same morning, fuel sales at Crimean petrol stations would be suspended entirely, with what remained reserved for government agencies and state-owned companies. Power also went out across parts of the peninsula, according to the local utility company Crimea. Days later, on June 24th, Ukrainian drones struck the Simferopol power station and a major electrical substation in Sevastopol, cutting electricity to large parts of both cities and knocking out water pressure in the process. The peninsula declared a state of emergency. Sevastopol's Kremlin-installed governor ordered supermarkets, bars, and restaurants to close by 8 in the evening to conserve power, and occupation officials in Crimea reportedly canceled hundreds of children's summer camps that had been scheduled to run through the season. Food is running out right alongside fuel and electricity. RBC Ukraine reports that supermarket shelves across Crimea are increasingly bare, with basics like cereal, sugar, flour, and pasta in short supply. A shortage made worse by the fact that food distributors can no longer get enough fuel to move their products to market. None of this is accidental. Ukraine is deliberately squeezing Crimea's fuel and food supply, and in doing so, making sure that everyone living under occupation there understands exactly who bears responsibility for it. And then there's the Kerch Bridge itself, the only fixed link between Crimea and Russia now that the land routes are under constant fire. It is not the reliable lifeline it once was. Ukrainska Pravda reported that occupation authorities suspended traffic on the bridge from late on June 25th until the following morning, by which point roughly 2,500 vehicles were backed up waiting to cross. Satellite imagery examined by Radio Liberty's investigative unit, Schemes, showed a traffic jam stretching more than 10 kilometers toward the crossing, made up largely of civilians trying to leave the peninsula rather than enter it. The bridge is now routinely closed for hours at a time over drone alerts, air defense activity, or the threat of Ukrainian sea drones in the strait, and each closure paralyzes both civilian and military traffic simultaneously. Ukraine's defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, put it bluntly in a June 17th interview, saying flatly that hell is beginning for the occupiers as logistics collapse and the peninsula becomes increasingly cut off. That's not hyperbole. It's a description of what satellite photography is already showing. It's worth stepping back here because Crimea isn't the only place feeling the weight of this campaign. Ukraine has been striking far beyond the peninsula to choke off the wider machinery that keeps Russia's war running. On June 22nd, Ukraine's general staff said it had critically damaged the main antenna at the Vladimir Space Communications Center, roughly 200 kilometers east of Moscow, along with a second antenna at the Dubna facility north of the capital, both used to relay satellite feeds Russia relies on to track Ukrainian movements and coordinate its forces. The same week, Ukrainian drones hit a components plant in Voronezh tied to Russian cruise missiles and Pantsir air defense systems, and a gas processing plant in Orenburg responsible for a large share of the gas Gazprom processes nationwide, including materials used in rocket engines and aircraft wiring. A day earlier, on June 21st, drones struck the Tyumen refinery in western Siberia, more than 2,000 kilometers from Ukrainian territory. President Volodymyr Zelensky said the strike had been carried out using new drones built by the Ukrainian manufacturer Firepoint, telling a national telethon that Ukraine's reach would keep expanding, adding, they will reach 3,000 plus. Energy Intelligence, a U.S.-based research firm, estimated earlier this year that roughly a third of Russia's oil refining capacity has already been knocked offline by strikes like these. None of it is separate from the Crimea campaign. It's the same strategy at a larger scale. Degrade the arteries, and everything downstream, including the peninsula, starts to fail. Back on the ground, the effects are showing up exactly where you'd expect. Crimea has long served as a staging ground for Russian assaults into Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, and as its logistics collapse, that pressure on Ukraine's defenses is easing. Reuters reported that Ukraine reclaimed more than 600 square kilometers of territory in a counterattacking push through early June, and open-source assessments from the Center for Strategic and International Studies indicate Russia lost ground for a second consecutive month in June, alongside losing the battlefield initiative it had held for months prior. Every kilometer Ukraine takes back brings its forces closer to Crimea itself, which in turn opens up new opportunities to strike the peninsula's logistics from even shorter range. It's a feedback loop, and right now it's running in Ukraine's favor. Crimea isn't completely defanged yet, to be clear. On the night of June 14th into June 15th, Russia launched 6-3 M22 Zircon anti-ship missiles from the peninsula, part of a barrage that included over 600 strike drones fired into Ukraine that night. Crimea can still hurt Ukraine, but every one of those launch sites is now a target, and with air defense systems being methodically stripped away and logistics cut off, resupplying and repairing those sites is getting harder and riskier by the week. There's a financial story running underneath all of this, too. Putin himself said back in March that Russia has spent roughly $15.5 billion occupying Crimea since 2014, and that figure is starting to look like money poured down the drain. The new Voice of Ukraine reports that Russia's overall war spending is now so high it could exceed the country's entire 2026 budget by as much as $28 billion. Every dollar Moscow now has to spend defending, resupplying, and repairing Crimea is a dollar it doesn't have for anything else, at a moment when its economy is already staring down a looming recession. None of this is happening in a vacuum either. Diplomatically, the war remains stuck. Rounds of trilateral talks between the United States, Ukraine, and Russia in Abu Dhabi and Geneva earlier this year ended without a breakthrough on the core issues: territory, security guarantees, and a lasting ceasefire. In June, Zelensky publicly floated the idea of a direct meeting with Putin, arguing there was little sense waiting on shifting American attention. The Kremlin's response was to reject the overture and reassert its demand for full control of the Donbass as a precondition for any deal. Moscow has argued that talk of peace rings hollow while its adversaries keep arming Kyiv, and it has dismissed European involvement in mediation outright, insisting Europe is too firmly aligned with Ukraine to act as any kind of neutral broker. As of the start of July, that stalemate hasn't moved, and that's exactly why Ukraine's Crimea campaign matters strategically, not just militarily. A ground invasion to physically retake the peninsula still looks unlikely anytime soon, but making Crimea useless to Russia, an occupied territory that costs billions to hold and delivers less and less military value in return, gives Ukraine leverage at any table where these talks eventually resume. If Putin refuses to negotiate seriously, he keeps paying an ever steeper price to hold a peninsula that is becoming less defensible and less livable by the month. Militarily, Crimea is now less useful to Russia than at any point since the 2014 annexation. Frontline troops who once relied on supplies and reinforcements flowing out of the peninsula are increasingly being sent into assaults before anything arrives to support them, and the result is exactly what you'd expect: weaker attacks and heavier losses. What was supposed to be one of Russia's greatest strategic assets has become one of its clearest liabilities, a peninsula that drains money, manpower, and political capital while providing shrinking returns. Reports out of occupied Crimea in recent days suggest some officials are already quietly making their own exit plans, reportedly securing state fuel allocations to leave the peninsula, even as ordinary residents queue for hours over a tank's worth of gasoline. The puppet regime installed there is supposed to be celebrating Russian gains. Instead, it's stuck explaining away power cuts, empty shelves, and near-daily fires from Ukrainian strikes it can't stop. Put all of it together: the burning highways, the disabled bridges, the fleeing warships, the rationed fuel, and one description keeps surfacing in the reporting on this war: Russia's rear, once considered safely out of reach, is no longer peaceful. That phrase captures something important. This was never just a story about one peninsula. It's a story about a war that Russia assumed it could fight without ever paying a price at home, and about a Ukrainian strategy specifically built to make sure that assumption stops holding. So where does this leave things? Ukraine isn't slowing down, and every indication points to this campaign accelerating through the summer. The roads into Crimea keep burning. The bridges keep getting hit and re-hit faster than Russia can repair them. The fleet keeps retreating further from the peninsula it was built to defend. And the people living under occupation keep absorbing the consequences of a war their occupiers started. Liberation, if it comes, may not arrive through the march of Ukrainian soldiers across the Perekop Isthmus. It may come through the slow, grinding collapse of everything that made holding onto Crimea worthwhile for Russia in the first place. That's the bet Ukraine is making with this campaign, and so far the evidence suggests it's paying off. If you want to see exactly what that collapse looks like on the ground, We've covered the strike on the Armyansk crossing in detail elsewhere on this channel, showing a column of Russian vehicles that drove onto that bridge and within 2 minutes simply weren't there anymore. Go check that video out after this one. And if you found this analysis valuable, do us a favor. Subscribe to Military Show, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment with what you want us to cover next. This war is moving fast, Crimea's isolation is deepening by the week, and we'll be here tracking every development as it happens. Thanks for watching.